and that you will see right in front of you right now, that you will see a little bunny rabbit. Okay, and the question is, are you listening? And so, the topics about are you listening are that we're going to cover today is boundaries and relationships. Okay, in order to have a relationship with somebody, you really need to have uh, an idea of the concept of boundaries. So I'm going to talk on that subject. I'm also going to talk on conflict because when people are not listening to each other, we have conflict. And the other aspect of listening is, what do I do when I'm angry or somebody's angry at me? What happens to the communication there? So there are the three topics that I'm going to in some way give you some information on. And again, if you have a question, do put it into chat, and then hopefully I can answer it for you at the end of our session. So boundaries and relationships, what am I talking about when I talk about them? I think you all might remember a feeling of this, the prince and the princess going off happily, at the end. And so, but boundaries and relationships are not that, okay? They can be very turbulent. So let's look at a definition of boundary. Boundary is being aware of our boundaries and limits is useful and crucial to having a healthy relationship. A boundary or limit is how far we can go with comfort in a relationship. It delineates where I and my physical and psychological space end and where you and yours begins. And that is a very particular thing to notice. It delineates where I and my physical, in other words, where I am physically with you, because it's a physical experience, because somebody steps into your space, then you feel it, and a psychological one as well. So you need to know where you and the other person begins. Okay. It means you have to have a semi-permeable membrane to know when to allow in and when to keep out, so that it's not a rigid one. This means you have a choice in your life. It means you will be an active rather than a passive participant in it when that membrane is permeable. So I'm going to show you a diagram now of a healthy relationship. So you can see here I've got two circles, one saying my personal space and me in the middle. And so I have my personal space, my physical and my psychological space around me. Then I have the other person who is also in their little semi-permeable, sort of space. And that's a healthy relationship because I can see you through a neutral space. I know that you are another person. I know that you are not me. I know that you come from a different culture. I know that you've had different experiences in your life, and that, they have had an impact. And so therefore, just because I think of something, it doesn't mean that you think the same way as me. Here is an unhealthy relationship where we have an unhealthy boundary. And as you can see in this particular case, that there is no more personal space or neutral space. They have merged. In this kind of relationship, what might be apparent is that because I think of something, you also think the same. I make an assumption all the time about you. I know you more than you know yourself. And how many times have you experienced that when somebody says, I know what's better for you, I know what's more healthier for you, rather than you have some input into that. And unfortunately, this is usually what happens in long-term relationships, where we have this kind of merging. And we need to go back here to the one here on the left. Okay, we need to go back here to knowing that this person is not me. Even though you've been married to them for the last 20 years, in those last 20 years they have changed, and you need to recognize that. Okay, so that's an important thing, because otherwise you will not be able to communicate or be able to listen to the other. Let's have a look at symptoms of unhealthy boundaries. It will be difficult for us to start to sort out who is unsafe to be around if we don't have a healthy boundary. It would be hard to define myself because I would be more merged in what the other person is thinking of me. It would be hard to know myself. Without boundaries, you may not even feel that you have a self, because at this stage you might be more, sort of dependent on the other rather than know what your own needs are. A key to my boundaries, therefore, is knowing my inner life. And what I mean by my inner life, I mean what your sort of your feelings are, so and your unconscious is. But let me define it a little bit more. It's about my beliefs, my wants, and my unconscious. It's about my thoughts, my needs, and my dreams. It's about my feelings, my sensations, and my fantasies. It's about my decisions, my intuitions, and anything patterns that I might repeat. It's about my choices, my compulsions. It's about all of my experiences and all of my unfinished business. That's my inner life. And so if I don't know this, then the chances are that I am going to project onto the other. So it's important that I begin to know that, because often when we ask somebody, what do they need or what do they want? It is sometimes very hard for them to express it. So keys to having a healthy boundary. It needs to be flexible and adaptable as it feels appropriate for our wants and needs and other aspects of our inner life. Have you ever declined interest in something and then it being pushed on you by another? Then you later became interested in it and perhaps even profited by whatever they had been promoting. So therefore, if my boundary was rigid, then I wouldn't have accepted this, and therefore I wouldn't have got what I need. So your boundaries need to be flexible. I need to be able to, in some way, be able to move towards a person when I'm comfortable and be able to move back and detach when I'm uncomfortable. And I need to have that flexibility rather than having a rigid boundary where I actually do the same thing no matter who the person is on the other side where I'm having to communicate with. So how are boundaries abused then? The active codependent. And so what do I mean by that? The active codependent person tends to be fixed in either few or no boundaries. They are often boundarylessness, or the opposite, overly rigid boundaries, and they often flip-flop between these. So what do I mean by an active codependent? And if I was to describe it, I'm going to take the more acute version of it. And that is in a case where you grew up in a family where your mother was an alcoholic, an acute alcoholic. And what you learned during that particular time in your life, that in order to be safe, I had to make my mother happy. I had to put a smile on her face in the morning. Otherwise, I might not get fed. Otherwise, my day would be miserable. So you got used to, therefore, sort of making sure that she got what she wanted. All right. So you became actively codependent on her being happy so that you could be happy. And we often, every single one of us are probably to some extent active codependents, but it depends on the intensity. Okay. So the question is, am I always dependent on the other person to be happy before I can allow myself to be happy? Am I always moving towards making the other person feel safe before I can feel safe and comfortable? And if that's what's happening, then you're probably moving into boundaries and being abused in it. And also, what you have a tendency to do is never get what you need or want. Have you ever been told what you should believe, think, feel, decide, or choose? If so, then your boundaries may have been invaded at that time. Rather than being able to explore with a person what you might need and want, if the other person says you should do this, then you have you have no part in it, and so therefore your boundary is being abused. Has anyone ever accused you or blamed you for something that you did or that was actually their issue? And again, here you haven't had the ability to explore this with them. And so therefore you probably have gone ahead and taken the blame. Has anyone projected some of their unfinished business or issues onto you? And that is another boundary abuse. And this is one that we constantly do. I think you'd be a saint not to do it. A good example of this would be you've had a pretty miserable day. You're frustrated, you're fed up, you're irritated. And I think a lot of us at the moment through COVID are experiencing this on a daily basis. And so what you do then is that somebody does something on you in the house, doesn't do something you want them to do, doesn't empty the dishwasher. And so what you do then is you project all of that unfinished business onto them. It's like there's a murder has occurred in the house now, but all they haven't done is put the kettle on. Does that make sense? Because all that unfinished business, all that irritability and sort of frustration that has mounted up inside of you is now projected onto them. Other mental, emotional areas where personal boundaries are abused is our sexuality, our needs, our time alone, our intuitions, and even our individual differences. If you can't allow yourself to have them and to be able to express them with another, then your boundaries are being abused. Has anybody ever drained your energy so much that you neglected your own needs, so that their needs are more important than yours, and you haven't been able in some way to express how important it is for your needs to be met? Some other mental and emotional areas where personal boundaries can be abused are messenger function. Has anybody inappropriately convinced you to deliver a message to a third party? Okay. Rather than telling the person themselves. And then what happens is that something happens in the way you've told the story, or you haven't told it right. And then what happens, you end up being the pig in the middle, and you're the one that's blamed if something doesn't happen, if the thing isn't right. And that again is a boundary. So when somebody asks you to be the messenger function, you should ask them the question, why? Why can't they tell this to the other person? Or if somebody asks you to, I'm saying this in confidence to you, be very careful that you're not the only one that's been told that this message is being given in confidence. And then if it lets out, you be the one that will be targeted for it. So in relationships and boundaries, you can have a relationship, whether transient or long-term, with any person. Using boundaries limits helps you to communicate your needs in an effective way. But what happens if there is conflict? So let's look at some conflict definitions. Conflict is a lack of acceptance of ourselves. Okay, so when we can't accept ourselves and accept who we are, we have a tendency to blame the other, which causes conflict. It's a way of blaming others for what we perceive as failures in our own lives. A need to hide behind roles or masks that do not reflect our authentic self, which is a common thing that we do. Very few of us don't hide behind roles or masks because it's a management strategy that we have learned. But often that management strategy causes conflict because the person on the other side of the relationship can't see how you're really feeling. The obvious one of this is when you say to somebody, I'm fine, but inside you're frustrated. Inside you're in pain. Inside you're feeling that your needs are not being met. But how do you expect them to know that if what you are saying to them is I'm fine and you're putting up that mask? Conflict represents a boundary issue, as we have already said. If I'm not being authentic, if I'm not in some way allowing myself to express my needs and wants, therefore how is the other person going to know what it is? Conflict is a way of getting attention, acknowledgement, and sympathy. And sometimes this is what we do. We create a conflict so somebody sees us, so somebody acknowledges, or somebody gives us sympathy. Conflict represents a lack of skill or experience at being able to handle certain kinds of behavior. So rather than addressing somebody's behavior, we will enter into a conflict, or we will act out of a behavior in order to create a conflict. Conflict represents a lack of listening, a failure to appreciate the subtlety of what someone else is saying. And because that is such a big part of conflict, I'm going to talk about that, separately, and define it even more. Conflict can exist both internally and externally when we lack clarity in saying what we feel, think, or want. And we do have internal conflict because one part of us says, I want to do this, and another part of us says, no, I don't want to do this. And so therefore, because of that internal conflict, we're not very clear in what we say and what we do. So let's have a look at the styles of managing conflict. And these, when I go through these styles, I really want to say to you that each one of these styles is a healthy way of managing conflict. But what we need to be aware of is which is our automatic default and which ones do I not do. Because if we have an automatic default, is that every time there's a conflict, this is exactly what kind of style I will operate, and I don't recognize the others. And you may need to recognize which of these styles do you never use, and which it might be appropriate for you to use. So because of that, I'm also going to send Philippa a conflict questionnaire. So if any of you want to do this questionnaire, it will define for you what is your default one and what is the one that you least do. And then at least then by knowing that you may be able to manage conflict in a better way. So let's have a look at the styles of conflict. There are 5 styles of managing conflict. The avoider. The avoider is the person who is unassertive, uncooperative, and pursues their own interest, nor the interest of the other person. So they really are just for what they need themselves. Issues remain unaddressed either through being ignored or postponed, or by just withdrawing altogether. And this is often the person who stonewalls you. Okay, you can't actually have a conversation with them, because they're not responsive at all. Okay. The next one is the accommodator. The accommodator is the unassertive person, but they're cooperative, often sacrificing their interest for the perceived good of the relationship. This approach may take the form of selfless generosity or complying with somebody's demands. Then we have the competitor or the assertive. The competitor or the assertive is the opposite to the accommodator. They pursue their own interests at the expense of the opponent. They focus literally on power, on argument, and position to get what they need. Then we have the collaborator. The collaborator is both assertive and cooperative, the opposite of the avoider. The collaborator works with the person and parties so that they can achieve their goals. This usually requires them going beyond the issues that each side brings, and often what they do is they brainstorm. The compromiser. The compromiser is somewhere between the assertive and the cooperative, valuing expediency and may be willing to accept partial solutions. So in order to manage conflict, you need to figure out which one of these styles do I operate from? Which ones do I least do? And which ones do I automatically do? And why do I not do the others? And is it appropriate that the others could happen? And it is appropriate that all of these styles are healthy ways of managing conflict. So the keys to managing conflict are identifying what style of conflict that you automatically adopt and what style you least adopt. Practicing active listening. And this is the reason why, it is probably one of the keys to managing conflict and managing boundaries is active listening. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. As Oscar Wilde puts it, sometimes I don't know what I think until I say it and it's heard. That's the most important piece, is the last one. I don't know what I think until I say it and it's heard. So what is active listening? Good listening is an attitude and a collection of skills. It's not something that you automatically have. It's something that you practice at. It's not a destination that you arrive at. It's something that you practice at every day. It is based on listening with an open mind, listening to you rather than just for me. I'm listening because you're another person. I'm listening because you have something to say to me. It is empathic listening where you put yourself in the shoes of the other person without judging, interpreting, and attempting to live through their context, background, and experience. So what types of active listening are there? We have what we call reflective listening, which is demonstrating an understanding by I paraphrase and I reflect back what I believe the other person has said. And this is often very good if somebody is in a venting mood and they keep talking and talking and talking, and all they're doing is narrating. And so what you can do is say to them, look, I just want to stop you there because I'm going to paraphrase what I felt I heard you say. And it has the ability of the other person, being mirrored back what they've said, and they're now hearing what they're saying. Okay. And they also get the experience that you have actually been listening and understanding them. There's also integrative listening. And what we mean by integrative listening is listening for key messages, which are the underlying needs that that person is trying to convey. So again, somebody could be constantly saying, well, you didn't do this, and I asked you to do this, and you didn't do it, and you didn't do it yesterday, and you didn't do it a year ago, and you never do it. Rather than the underlying issue here is, you're taking me for granted. The underlying issue here is you're not hearing what I need. And sometimes you can cut a person, that way, rather than just going into a defense with them and just say, okay, can I just stop you here and just ask the question, is this what you're trying to say to me? Are you trying to say to me that I'm taking you for granted? And then that's the topic of conversation that goes on. Otherwise, all you're doing is like a tennis match, one throwing mud at each other across the net. What is not listening? What is not listening is distinctive listening. This is listening to agree, to refute, to debate, or to argue with somebody. And that's your intention, because you have now an agenda. You know where you want this conversation to go, and you're not prepared to listen to what the other person is going to say to you. Where you have an agenda, as I said there, and we're trying to convince the other. So what are the benefits of good listening then? It gives you validation and acceptance. We provide an opportunity to acknowledge the personal perspective of the other. It helps the other to articulate their needs. It helps people to feel good about themselves and clear about their own needs and interests. It gives them time to even figure out what their needs are. It creates that environment where whatever they say will in some way be heard and validated. It can transform relationships by empowering the individuals and encourage them to accept each other because they are different. So keys to active listening: self-awareness. You need to be aware of yourself. You need to be aware of your needs. You need to be aware of what ways you manage conflict. You need to be aware of what triggers your anger. And because anger is such a big piece in how we communicate our needs, I'm going to hopefully have time maybe to talk about a little bit about that. So we need to be self-aware. We need to try and empathize. We need to try and see something from another person's perspective by asking questions, by not judging them. In the heat of the moment, we need to stop and respond, not react just because we've been triggered. So try and recognize the reason why the other person is venting or why you're venting, and listen for new information. Leave your negative emotions behind you. Don't go into a communication with somebody already being negative unless you can explain to them that's where you're coming from. Get to the main points, because us Irish people, we have the greatest ability to go around the scenic route and not really say what we need or want. React to ideas, not the person. And sometimes we have to do that. Oh my God, here he goes again. Same old, same old. But this time they might have a great idea, but we haven't heard it because we've now labeled them. Don't argue mentally. And often we do this in sort of, in our relationships with people. We even do it when they're not there. We go away and we'll argue the situation in our head. We'll even answer on behalf of the other person in our head. We make a conclusion to this and go back and give that person the conclusion because we've worked it out in our heads, but we haven't actually in any way connected with the other person in it. Listen to how something is said, because we just don't talk words. We also talk in the way, our facial expressions, the tone of our voices, and don't antagonize the speaker, because we often do that. We think of a way that we crack a joke, which we know will really antagonize them, or we bring up an old issue that we know will antagonize them, and so therefore the conversation is now lost. Okay, I think we're okay for time. Just to quickly run through anger. Yeah, anger, is it a healthy emotion, or is it an unhealthy emotion? When we can express anger appropriately and in a healthy way, we are capable of using its energy to meet some injustice, to stand our ground, or to reprimand where necessary. It is important for us to do that. And we're angry because our tone is angry, because it's an important thing for us to do. However, we must do this without bullying, terrorizing, or shaming others. Is this familiar? When we cannot be comfortable with the emotion of anger, we will either explode or implode. Exploding, we give hell to others, and they do not hear us. Imploding, we give hell to ourselves, and this is what we call reactive depression. It has a physical and psychological impact on ourselves because we're holding this emotion in. And because we're holding this emotion in, there is very little space for any other emotion, for us to have any other experience of another emotion. And this is what we call reactive depression. We operate from the reptilian brain, okay? It's part of our survival mechanism. And when we're angry, we often activate out of here. But unfortunately, we can't beat the shit out of people anymore. We'd love to, but we can't. So all we've got left, okay, is words, okay? And so, our ancestors were able to repel people, by building fortresses, but we can't do that. We can only protect ourselves with words. And so we therefore have to learn how to be constructive and how to express those words so people actually hear that this is important to me. So can we embrace or manage anger? And I think it's important that we make the distinction between angry behavior that is destructive and is rage, and angry feelings, which may be telling us that something, that we're saying something important about this in our relationship. Angry behavior can be destructive, but anger as an emotion is a message, and it's important to learn to embrace it and to value it for what it's trying to teach us, but find a constructive way of voicing it and managing it so the other person hears it. I'm going to quickly run through some examples here of how we could, sort of manage anger and manage, sort of communication. I need to say something, I am hurting about something and it's eating me up inside. So saying that to somebody rather than what we might normally do, because this allows us to admit that we are hurt. It takes a lot of courage. Your suffering is real for you. It might be important to communicate that, to give the other person a chance of understanding that the tensions that have risen between you, and you want to explore it. And that's the important. You're saying, I want to say something because I want you to hear it, because I want you to explore it with me. Example 2. I'm doing my best with this and I don't want to make things worse. Because here what you're trying to say is to let somebody know that there is a problem here, and for them to take some time to think about it. That you're trying to understand how they are feeling and how you may have contributed to the situation, rather than simply blaming them for what they have done. So you're saying to them, I'm doing my best here and I don't want to make things worse. So how can we explore it? Example 3. I need your help with this. When you are angry with another person, you have a natural tendency to push them away. You do want, because they've hurt you, you're pushing them away. And so you need to help with this, to communicate this. You avoid them and are passive aggressive, or you're overly assertive. Opening up with the possibility that you need them also to resolve this crisis with you, that they're a part of the crisis, that they're part of what has happened here, will appeal to their more empathic or compassionate side. You are sending a message that there is a possibility of compromise, rather than that you are trying to avoid, or you're trying to be too assertive. Example 4. What do you think we each need from this relationship at this time? So what you're saying here is that you're telling them that you're hurt, and that you need to be, you need that need that is not being clearly expressed. There's something that's not being clearly expressed. Moving beyond anger to the underlying need that you both have in this relationship allows for clarity and expresses the value we have in this relationship. So what you're saying to them is I'm here and I'm feeling this because I care for you. If I didn't care for you, I wouldn't be doing this. I value this relationship enough to put myself into this position. It also helps to move the relationship forward, because we now know where the other is coming from and that they may have different beliefs and wants. And in conclusion here, when each person is given a safe place to say what they need or want and are heard, when each person is given a safe place to say what they need or want and are heard, the solution to the crisis, the way forward, becomes a lot clearer, and communication is easier, and there is a chance that you both get what you both need in this relationship. So if I come back here.
Right, Mary?
Okay. I know I've loaded a lot of information there to you, because this area of communication is such a wide area, that I wanted you to get a flavor of what is behind it all. And how important it is that this is something that we have to practice. It's a daily practice. It's a daily learning. But what you really need to know is, and I think what's the most important bit is in the boundary area, is that the person in front of you is not you. It's somebody different. And you need to be curious about them and about what they're trying to say. In the conflict situation, you need to be creating an atmosphere where you're not automatically falling back into an old style, and you're not realizing that there's other ways I can do this. In the anger, or should I say now, the active listening, that is a huge area. I mean, as a therapist, I spent 5 to 6 years and constantly learning how to be an active listener. So it's something that we have to keep on practicing. But one of the main areas is on active listening is to, in some way, be reflective about what you're hearing. Stop the person, summarize, and say, look, is this what you're saying? And trying to figure out, what are they trying to say, even though they're going around the scenic route, and try and find the underlying thing. And then in conflict, okay, then what you need to do in conflict is just, you know, I'm sure you did the conflict. What about anger is just really looking at that anger is a healthy emotion, but it's how I express it is important. But it is a healthy emotion and I need to have it. It has a physical and a psychological aspect to it. The physical aspect to it is we may need to go and beat the pillow. Does that make sense? Or kick a football and get that bit out of it. But the psychological piece is I need to say something to you because you've really hurt me. And I need to find a way of making that clear. So that would be my summary of it. So I'm just wondering, do we have any questions that I can?
We do have a few questions in there. Can you hear me, Mary?
I can indeed, yeah.
Very
Go
good.
ahead.
I see one here from Anne in Leash. If the boundaries haven't been there, how do you recreate boundaries?
Very good question. Uh, if the boundaries are not there, how do I create them? Okay, when you realize that what a boundary is about how I can go in comfort with somebody, and if those boundaries are not there, the chances are they have never been there in one of those people since childhood. Does that make sense? So what you might be having in front of you is a tantrum child, a child who's not willing to listen. So, you know, if there's a boundary issue and if it's really affecting the relationship and you're not getting any sort of response from that person, I would encourage you to go to a professional and go to a relationship counselor where they are then, you know, sort of there mediating and helping you to create a good boundary between you. Okay. Otherwise, I would suggest buy a book. There's a great book called Boundaries and Relationships by a fellow called Charles Whitfield. Excellent book to read and will give you all the tools you need to create the boundaries.
Great. There's a few more in here. I would rather avoid conflict. How would you suggest I become more assertive without coming across as aggressive?
Yeah, very good question. Okay, if you're naturally a avoider, okay, um, what is happening probably most of the time is that um, there is a conflict situation, okay, and you don't feel comfortable enough in saying what you need and want, okay, all right, and so then you avoid it. But you know the best thing for an avoider to do is say, look, hey, listen, I need time to process what's going on, okay, and by saying that and you saying I'll come back to you when I have time to reflect on this, and I'm going to come back to you tomorrow at a certain time. And that gives you a chance to back off, to process what you need, to even write it down on a piece of paper. Does that make sense? Come back into the relationship with somebody, okay, and say, this is where I am. And so therefore you're not being aggressive now, but you're being assertive in your needs because you've given yourself some time to process. Now, also, it's given the other person a chance to also realize that, you know, there is something very important going on here, and it gives them a chance to back off and actually ask themselves the question, what am I contributing here that's making you avoid me? Does that make sense? So it gives a lot of space. um, so, you know, and then what you might find yourself doing is rather than being the avoider, you might find yourself being a little bit more assertive. If you can't be as assertive, you might find yourself, you know, sort of just, you know, being the collaborator. So you're actually going to have, you're going to say some of your needs, okay, but you're also going to be a little bit more cooperative as well. I don't know if that answers that question for you.
I just have one more in here now as well, from Oliver. So, is compromise an important concept to a healthy relationship?
Not if it's your only way of managing a relationship. If you're constantly compromising, okay, all right, the chances are that people know, Oliver compromises, okay. So if we want something to do that's difficult, oh, we'll call Oliver because he will always compromise. Okay, so that's why I'm saying that all of these styles are an important way of managing a relationship. and we need to practice them all, because at different times we need to practice it. So, and sometimes, Oliver, you may actually, in a relationship, need to be assertive and say, well, this is a need I want, and I can't compromise on it because it's that important. Or you may need to accommodate and sort of say, okay, for the interest of the relationship, I'll let this go. Or you may need to be more collaborative and sort of say, okay, I'm going to say what my needs are, but I'm also going to be a little bit more cooperative. Or you might need to say, look, I have to avoid this. And one of the areas that avoidance is such a healthy style is when two of you have drink on you. We have this idea that when we're drinking and we have an argument with somebody, we're telling the truth. You're not telling the truth. What you're doing is you're just unleashing all of your unrepressed, or all should I say, all of your repressed frustrations, which could go back for years and years and years. You're not actually telling the truth. It's a laugh with us in as therapists, is one of our favorite jokes. It would be great if all of our clients came in with a few drinks on them, because then we would actually know what's going on in their unconscious. Okay, but it's not the truth. Okay. So I hope that answers that, Oliver, for you.
Great. I don't see any more questions coming in, Mary, so I think we can wrap up.
Yeah.
So a huge thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
That's great.